Welcome back. We're now on Lecture 6, the Minoan and Mycenaean Cultures. This is, of course, leading us up to the flowering of ancient Greece. And so we'll look at the Minoan culture first. You may associate the Minoan culture most closely with mythological creature and story that you're probably familiar with, the story of the Minotaur. Obviously, that is connected to this culture. We'll also be looking at the Mycenaean culture. So remember, the Minoans are on the island of Crete, and the Mycenaeans are going to control basically the entire of the Aegean Sea, but also they will have their home base on the Greek mainland. So the first place to be familiar with, first object, first architectural monument to be aware of is the Palace of Knossos. It is by far the largest and best preserved of palace structures that are associated with the Minoan culture. There are at least 4 palace sites that have been discovered that remain in ruined form on the island of Crete, and Knossos is by far the most famous of them. It is likely, from what we have learned of this palace, that this is in fact what gave rise to the idea of the labyrinth. And of course, we'll see connection here again to the story of the Minotaur that was interred within that labyrinth. You can see from the floor plan of the palace how incredibly complex it was and how many separate rooms there were. So the building would have functioned for a lot of different purposes. It is not only the living space for the royal family, but there's also functional spaces, quite a few of them, workshops and storehouses. So the wealth of the city-state was very much controlled and contained within the palace. You can see that the palace structure, similar in a way to Persepolis, is on multiple levels. Some of the buildings are multi-story. We have plenty of examples of staircases. You can see that here. And you can also see wide open spaces as well, courtyards. And we'll see that in a lot of different architecture in this particular unit. Definitely with the Minoan culture, we see the attempt at enlivening the architecture through painting. And we so often think, especially when we get to ancient Greece, of all of these temples and palace buildings being of white marble and very starkly white, but they would have been gloriously painted. And we know a lot about the Minoan culture through studying the painting that they did in their palaces especially. Notice too that you have something that starts to feel like Greek architecture. We've certainly seen this building technique before, the vertical, 2 or 3 in this case, vertical supports holding a horizontal element. That's post and lintel architecture, of course, right? But you notice that now those posts have been really articulated into columns with capitals, and those capitals look a little bit like they're kind of smushed in comparison to what the full Greek style will look like when we move into our analysis of Greek architecture. You'll see a difference, especially when you're looking at the capitals. You'll also notice that the columns seem to taper and get smaller toward their bases, that they kind of swell at the top and taper downward. So it also gives a sense of kind of liveliness, springiness to the building itself. So there are specific throne rooms within the palace, one for the king, one for the queen. We believe that men and women had a more equal relationship in this culture, and that in fact the lineage of the royal family, at least the royal family, was traced through the mother's line. We also know that within the palaces that there's a fairly sophisticated system of drainage and a method for bringing water inward. So one of the materials that was used becomes a vocab term for us at this point, terra cotta, which is essentially just baked clay. used not only for building, but it could, of course, be used as a sculptural material. So underground pipes of terra cotta have been found in the palaces. Stone pipes would also have been available. So you can think of the stone pipes being used for drainage and the terra cotta for the distribution of fresh water. So we know that they had systems of maintaining influx of clean water and removal of dirty water. This gives you more information on the Minoan water supply sections, which is pretty fascinating to think about. It's a technology that we think of as very, very modern. This ability to pump water and to have access to clean water is something we associate, of course, with very advanced civilizations. And here we are with this technology available to the Minoans. One of the things that I think is most beautiful about the palaces is their fresco decorations, which very much have a connection, I think, to some of the work that we've seen before. There's some similarity in the structure of the bodies that will probably remind you a little bit of ancient Egypt. And we know that the Minoans did have access through trade with the Egyptians and with other cultures. And so it's not at all unusual to think that there could be some crossover of cultural information, even artistic influence between these cultures. This is the fresco from the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete. I just want to zoom in a little bit for you so you can see the sections are in a state of disrepair. So you can see original sections, and then you can see areas that have been suggested to kind of finish out what the painting would have looked like. So it's not at all unusual to see these really intense colors, bright blues, reds, oranges, yellows, and blacks. It's a little bit more vibrant, I think, in its color than what we may be used to. And you can see all aspects of the life of the court depicted in these images. Very prominently, you'll notice that there are female figures throughout, and they are dressed rather elaborately. So this is the most likely scenario is that these are members of the ruling class. And you'll notice they have very elaborate hairstyles. Some of them are wearing really obvious amounts of jewelry, but they're all bare-breasted. So we believe that this would have been their cultural fashion as opposed to some form of oppression. It's much more likely that this is actually how women dressed. The bull leaping fresco is maybe the most famous of the images to come from the Palace of Knossos, and it does give us an insight into some aspects of culture and maybe even some aspects of religious function as well. You see in the center this very active bull who's kind of this glorious curved shape here in the center, and he seems to be kind of being taunted or encouraged, at least in which direction to move, by figures that are painted a slightly lighter color than the figure in the center. And again, we believe this to be a separation between the genders. So the lighter toned figures are the female figures, the darker skinned figure here is the male acrobat who is leaping over the bull's back. So we believe this to have been kind of a precursor to athletic displays, possibly leading to competitions like the Olympic Games, but it also could have clearly a religious function as well. We've seen bulls revered by a lot of the ancient cultures we've studied up to this point, and so perhaps confronting and trying to control a creature with this much power could have some religious significance for us as well. But it's also interesting to see that men and women both are involved in this spectacle. This is not something I don't think that you would do for just a random afternoon of trying to find a fun way to spend some time for recreation. I think this had to have had a more formal or serious aspect, either as a competition sport or perhaps as something with more deep religious connection. In either case, though, it associates men and women both with the threat of this dangerous beast in the form of a bull. And if you think about it, if we combine the complex architectural layout of the palace with this image, you can start to see the beginnings of the myth surrounding the Minotaur. So the story, if you don't know it, is really pretty interesting. The idea of the Minotaur is that the king Minos, his wife is impregnated by a bull. A god intervenes, and she is then the mother of a half-human, half-bull creature that the king is absolutely kind of terrified of, but as a sort of demigod is unable to bring himself to kill. The king has called out to the gods, and he has dishonored them, and so in that way he is being punished by them with this terrifying offspring. So he has a labyrinth constructed and hides the Minotaur within it, and then the people that he is subjugating send him male and female tributes, which he puts into the labyrinth, and then they are of course devoured by the Minotaur. So this story goes on until a hero arrives and the king's daughter falls in love with him and gives him a ball of thread so that he can tie one end off, go into the labyrinth, do battle with the Minotaur, and then still escape from its complex maze. Then, of course, she has to be rescued or taken away, really, from the island because she's defied her father, and our hero takes her off, and then they end up on another island, and he decides that he is no longer interested in her and abandons her, and she winds up falling in love with Dionysus, the god of wine. So she will eventually emerge probably a little bit better off than she would have been had she merely remained a princess. She does become the consort to a very powerful god. So you can see that the mythology of the ancient Greeks really does have its roots in cultures that we can really clearly see the influence of. And you can clearly see that here from the Minoan culture. If you think about the complexity of the palace and the reverence for the bull, you can start to imagine this mythological story coming to life in their religious belief system. Definitely something to think about with the fresco techniques, with the murals that are being painted here now that we're moving into the Proto-Greek cultures. The term we usually associate with it is the buon fresco. This is the Italian term for true fresco or good fresco, meaning that the fresco is done as painting on plaster, but done before the plaster has completely dried. And that would allow the pigment to actually be absorbed into the plaster, making the painting not so much on the wall as it is in the wall, becomes embedded into the plaster itself. That, of course, makes it much more durable, which is logical in a region where there will be fluctuations in moisture. The Egyptians did not do this. They used a technique called fresco secco, or dry fresco, because the arid climate in Egypt really was conducive to that. They didn't have to worry about paint flaking off the way other cultures would. You can clearly see, though, in this small section, this female figure in the Minoan style has her face in profile, and yet the eye fully facing forward. So it's a composite view, very much like what we saw in ancient Egypt. One of the really famous frescoes from the palace is this beautiful one of the dolphins. We'll see it in a little better slide in a moment, but I wanted you to see the photograph of the room the way it exists now, and then this kind of artistic recreation to the side. This is the Megaron of the Queen. So her throne room, reception room, it's where she would rule from and be waited upon and have her state visits. So when you look at the way that the figures are portrayed here, the bare-breasted, tiered skirt clothing is absolutely what we think the upper class, the elite of Minoan culture would have dressed like. And the colors are drawn very much from the color schemes of the building itself. We also know that the Minoans really pioneered this attention to decoration on ceramic vessels. So you see a lot of curvaceous, detailed forms on clay bodies, and these were most likely made partially as export. But you can see that in a lot of them, they reference creatures from the sea, and that is, of course, inherent to the Minoan culture. This is a seafaring culture. It would depend very much, you're living on islands, you're going to depend very much on the sea as a food source. And so it's not at all unusual to see the sea creatures as part of the decoration. This is by far, I think, people's favorite of the Minoan sea creature paintings on ceramic. It is so cool. The octopus amphora, the names of the vase shapes have very specific names in Greek culture, and we'll get to that. But this one is one that really does showcase the artist's ability to make use of a three-dimensional form to paint on, and how to accurately or appropriately fit an image into a compositional shape that isn't a rectangle or a square. If you notice, the way that the figure seems to kind of swell toward us has a bit to do with the shoulder of the vase. The widest part, the shoulder into the belly of the vase as it swells, is where a lot of our detail is, and it does give it a sense of dynamic movement. An octopus is a great character to use to fill this much space, and it certainly allows the artist to indulge in all this beautiful curvaceous linear work, as well as some cool pattern. The octopus vase that we see here is even more, I think, clever in the way that the figure fits into the body of the vase itself. In this case, the widest portion of the vase also brings us right into the facial features, the eyes at least, of the octopus. And it gives you a sense of incredible contemporary movement. This does not feel ancient and stiff like some of the artwork that we saw perhaps in ancient Mesopotamia. This feels like something is moving. However, just like we saw in ancient Egypt, one of the things to be aware of is that when we move away from depictions of people, especially royalty, and into lower, quote-unquote, lower beings, all the way down to animals, that's going to give us an opportunity to express more movement and more individual specifics, sort of observational specifics about those creatures, as opposed to trying to make an ideal form that glorifies a powerful person. It does provide the artist with a little bit different challenge and a little bit of an opportunity to create something that perhaps is more unique and expressive. There are some interesting male sculptures as well. The sad thing is that this piece is highly damaged. The building was caught fire, so this piece has damage to it, and it's remarkable that it survives at all. But it does give us a sense of the three-dimensionality of the forms that were favored by the sculptors of the Minoan culture. You can see that although the arms do kind of point back at the body, there's far more empty space between the limbs, and especially so between the legs. You can start to see that really increasing, especially as we get into ancient Greek work. One of the most famous of the Minoan statues is the Minoan snake goddess. The figure on the top of her head may not actually have been original to that piece, but the snakes are for sure, and we know that the clothing absolutely fits the style of the Minoan culture. We also know that the Minoan culture had greater parity between male and female. There is definite higher placement of women in this culture than we'll see in some others. The material that the piece is made from is really pretty remarkable as well. She is made from faience, which is glass-like clay, and we actually have seen a bit of faience work in other cultures. The glazed brick in the Ishtar Gate. There are some faience examples of jewelry in ancient Egypt in particular as well. We're also going to take note of the sistrum, the Egyptian percussion instrument, sort of like rattle or tambourine, and you can see that here. We'll see that in much greater detail when we get to the harvester vase. There we are. The Minoan harvester vase is a pretty remarkable object that shows, in some ways, an important event for the culture, but does kind of celebrate average everyday people. You see people harvesting their crops in kind of a procession as they move around this object. This particular form is a Ryton, which is a vessel specifically used for pouring out liquids as opposed to the jar shapes that are for storage of liquids. So this would have been seen at feasts or at public gatherings, at celebrations, at dinners. So it's important that it be a celebratory image. And it really is kind of a fascinating one as you look at the farmers returning with the bounty of the land. They certainly seem to conform to some things that we have seen in other cultures. We've got torsos that seem to face frontally, but the faces tend to be in profile with eyes that are facing frontally. So we've seen this a lot in ancient Mesopotamia. We certainly saw it in Egypt, but we're starting now to see more expressiveness. If you look at the individual expressions on the faces, especially those that are singing, and in particular the figure that's playing the sistrum, you can even see his ribs as he draws in air to be able to project his voice. It's a much more dynamic and alive and living style of art making. Definitely the bull is going to be seen as a very important religious image, and we see multiple images of the bull throughout the Minoan culture. We've seen bulls revered in other places, of course, but it is significant that it ties us once more to that story of the Minotaur. Definitely gold is going to be seen as an important material. We saw a lot of work in gold in ancient Egypt, but we're also going to see that coming into play with the Minoans and particularly the Mycenaeans. Akratiri is a fascinating place to study. This is really sort of the Minoan equivalent, if you will, of the Roman city of Pompeii. It was destroyed by a volcanic eruption. And in fact, that volcanic eruption caused the entire island to essentially be sunken into the sea. It was maybe the basis for the original legend of the lost city of Atlantis. So when the ruins were rediscovered as the palaces were unearthed and uncovered, we began to see really well preserved Minoan paintings. And those paintings depict a really lively culture tied directly to nature, especially tied directly to seafaring and to fishing. But you can see, again, that similarly with Egyptian painting, that the animals do tend to have a little bit more individualized movement. But you can see the palace structures look very much like what we've seen in the real world. These are depictions that give us a sense of the artist being very aware of the culture and giving us a glimpse into what their lives were like. You can see the multiple stories of the palaces. You can see on the sea as well. I really love the treatment on the animals as well. There are plenty of depictions of porpoises, dolphins. You'll see that quite frequently throughout the Aegean art. And as always, you do see some similarity to the Egyptian style in terms of these torsos turned toward us, but notice that the torsos narrow very much almost to like impossibly thin waists. We're going to see that as a very important aspect of early Greek art as well. So Akratiri is a pretty fascinating site to look at. It contains some of the most vivid and moving images. You can see here this boxing image that again brings us into that concept of the athletic competitions that might have led us to the Olympic Games. Moving on to the Mycenaean culture, and again, the Mycenaean culture now will dominate the whole of the Aegean landscape. One of the best places to start is the citadel at Mycenae. And so this was the home of King Agamemnon, who famously fought against the city of Troy and was successful in the use of the Trojan horse to bring down the city of Troy. This is his citadel, and so you see a wall around the outside of the city. You can also see the citadel itself raised up on a very easily defensible hillside. So this is not a site that was easy to invade. In fact, it was a site that was extraordinarily easy to defend. We often associate war with the imagery that comes to us from Mycenae, as opposed to the kind of peaceful images we saw in the Minotaur. So this is a pretty incredible site. Here's what we think it must have looked like at its height: a very carefully organized and complex arrangement of buildings that also included grave sites. And so there is a circular structure here that's still very noticeable in the remains that we are able to see today. That grave circle has what we call shaft graves or shaft burials in it. And we found a lot of remarkable things there as well. This is the main gate into the city. It is the Lion Gate, so called, although the heads of these creatures are missing, and there's some debate as to what the creatures might have been, whether they were all fully lions, which they appear to be at the base, or if they perhaps had eagle heads, which would make them griffins, is uncertain. But what we can tell for sure about Mycenaean architecture, it does still rely on post and lintel, as we've seen, but it introduces a new technique that is going to be very, very important for the Mycenaean culture: corbelling, which is this reverse stair-step effect. You can see how the higher I go, the further the elements of stone stick out over one another, almost like a stair step in reverse. So it's a way of creating essentially an arched surface that isn't a traditional arched shape that we would associate perhaps more with Rome. So this kind of tier shape that allows, or a tier, setting the stones in tiers rather, does create a sense of weight, and certainly these stones are incredibly large. Some of those stones were considered to be so big that when the site was fully excavated, people began to believe that the site could only have been built by a giant. And so sometimes the stones themselves, or even the walls, are referred to as Cyclopean, because the Cyclops was believed to have been an enormous giant, and only such a being would have been capable of lifting stones of this height and weight. So we've seen guardians at gates before. We saw that with the Lamassu. So more than likely, these are meant to be symbols of strength and intimidation from the gate at the citadel. Here you can see corbelling in a little bit easier to see diagram that helps you understand how the arch itself could be made. But check this out. This is corbelling to create a vaulted structure, a hallway with essentially an arched roof. And so what's happening is the stones are just slightly projecting more and more and more until they finally meet at the top to create a roof. You can imagine how intense this space would have been in terms of someone from the outside trying to attack. The wall that you're seeing there is from the citadel at Tiryns, and it averages about 20 feet in its thickest points. It's pretty incredible. Palace of Nestor. The fresco styles are somewhat similar. We still have profile faces and fully frontal eyes with pretty elaborate hair and jewelry. The Mycenaean images are going to be more covered. The women's upper bodies are going to be covered more clearly. And then this gives you a sense of what the grave sites were like. The ones that are in circled walled encampments like this would have markings at the top. That's sort of where you would revere the dead, but the actual burial would be extremely far down below that level. It's about 40 feet in depth. These are known as shaft graves. The Mycenaeans, we know a lot about what their culture was like from the things that they left behind in their burials, in the shafts and in other burial sites, much of which were bronze that were inlaid with gold or objects made entirely of gold. And so we do see things that represent hunts, that represent battles, and of course are themselves objects for defense or for battle, daggers, swords, and the like. Whether those things indicate that the culture was purely warlike or not, I think is a matter for debate, because of course you need a weapon to defend as well as you would need one to attack. One of the more remarkable discoveries, though, at the graves in Mycenae is the series of masks, what we refer to as funeral masks. And in fact, this one in particular was long believed to be a depiction of Agamemnon himself, but we know it actually comes from a completely different time and date. So it is, in some texts, older texts may even label it as the Mask of Agamemnon. This is entirely made of gold, though, and we found about 30 pounds worth of gold at the citadel in Mycenae. These images are somewhat crude, I suppose, by our standards today, but you see they do very much emphasize the face, the eyebrows and eyes in particular, but we see a lot more articulation of the ears and lips than we have in some other cultures that we've studied up to this point. That's my personal favorite one. It has kind of an odd moon-like face with a little bit of a hint of a grin, and the eyes appear to be more open rather than closed. It's kind of a unique object. All of these pieces were made with a technique known as reposse. So reposse is essentially hammering metal. Now, reposse is hammering metal from the back side in order to raise a surface up onto the front, and that could be done by making a relief carving in wood and then pressing the metal into that, hammering it from the back until it conforms into the negative spaces in the carving. And you kind of see that happening there at the lower right. We definitely have these remarkable cups that were discovered in Mycenae. And we've got the Mayan cup and the Minoan cup. We believe that the Minoan cup was being imitated by the Mycenaeans to make this pair. Another incredibly important burial site for us is the treasury of Atria, and this would be outside of the citadel walls. This particular building is one of the most remarkable examples of a domed structure, and in fact the largest domed structure in the world until Roman Pantheon, and it is made with the corbelling technique. Now, on the interior of this domed structure, those stones are carved to be at an angle, finished on their interior edges to be at an angle that conforms to the smooth curve of the room. It is essentially a perfect circle in its floor plan, and the height almost exactly equals that width. So we have an almost spherical shape to be inside of, with an enormously long causeway leading into that interior site. So we know that the burial and the reverence of the dead was an incredibly important aspect of the Mycenaean culture and belief system. One of the reasons I think that we associate the Mycenaeans with warlike nature is very much this particular object, which depicts soldiers leaving for battle. There are actually female images toward the sides near the handles that are bidding farewell to the figures. And you can see that the noses are a little bit exaggerated. They almost look a little bit like bananas hanging off their faces. But you can see that we have the body in profile in the torso, legs and head in profile, the eye fully frontally facing. So again, a composite view. We can see that the figures are in a register here, and that bottom line of the register, of course, becomes their ground line. So they do seem to march across that surface. Here's a shot that shows you the women saying farewell. They're almost cartoon-like in a way. They do seem to be smiling, which perhaps is a little odd. Perhaps they know that they're off to success, or they're feeling optimistic about the outcome. In any case, when we look at the sculptural examples, at the painted examples, we have to remember that these objects would have been really brightly painted. And they definitely give us a sense, I think, of liveliness and movement of the body. We see more and more removal of the negative spaces in between the limbs and the torsos, and that's certainly making the figures begin to have a more believable ability to move and to occupy space in the way that a real human body would occupy space.